Hello, and greetings from Glasgow, Scotland, and COP26. My name is Heather McTeer-Toney. I serve as the Vice President for Community Engagement at the Environmental Defense Fund, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a session on meeting the methane moment through equity and justice of Justice40. I am bringing you greetings on behalf of the Environmental Defense Fund, our President, Mr. Fred Krupp, and all of our staff from all over the world. We are so excited to be here with you and to have such amazing guests and a wonderful panel. I also need to bring some greetings from someone who unfortunately was unable to be with us. First, our Vice President for Environmental Justice and Equity, Margot Brown. Unfortunately, she was not able to travel with us here to Glasgow, but she is doing the work back in the United States. Hello, Margot. We hope you are well. And also to Ms. Catherine Flowers, who was going to be here with us today, but unfortunately had a few flight delays, but she is coming and will be here, and we're so grateful for her participation as well. Let's jump right into this because we have a wonderful panel today, and I'm so excited that we have such friends that are joining us and going to really bring some expertise to this conversation around methane and vulnerable communities and what are some solid solutions. And I'm so excited that I get to call these wonderful people mentors, friends, and friends to the organization. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
So let me start with some introductions. First, we have Peggy Shepard, who is the Director of WeACT for Justice. She is also Vice Chair for EDF Board of Trustees. We have Dr. Beverly Wright, who is the Director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And we have Dr. Robert Bullard from Texas Southern University and Director of the Bullard Center. All three of our panel members are members of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And I cannot tell you how happy I am that you're not only here at COP, but you're here with us today. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's jump right in. Ms. Shepard, let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit just about how the White House Environmental Justice Council just came together? Why is it so important?
You know, over the past 30-some years, the environmental justice movement in the United States has been privy to numbers of research and data that show the impact of pollution on our communities and on our health. And the Biden administration understood that to build back better, we had to address the systemic racism in our economic and environmental policies. And so as a result, there was an executive order that really developed the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is made up of over 26 environmental justice advocates representing regions of the country, identity groups as well, so it's very diverse. And those groups and those members are working in 3 working groups to provide recommendations to the administration. So we began those recommendations in May. The first working group was Justice40. And let me just explain what Justice40 is. Justice40 is a mechanism to invest 40% of the benefits of energy investments in frontline communities that have been so underinvested in over the decades. And so as a result, all of the federal agencies that are subject to the executive order, which are at least 19 or 20 of them, they are providing information to the Council on Environmental Quality around the programs and projects that will be subject to Justice40, as well as developing budgets along those lines as well. And so that interim guidance to the federal agencies is again directing those agencies to provide that kind of data. There'll be a final guidance that is developed at the end of February that really details how those agencies should implement Justice40. In addition, there is a working group on the executive order that really enhances how that executive order should be implemented, what agencies are subject to it, and what programs as well. And then finally, there is a climate and economic justice screening tool that will identify the communities, the frontline communities that should receive those investments.
I want to dig a little bit deeper on something you said about Justice40, defining what it is and the impacts to frontline communities. Dr. Bullard, you have worked for years along frontline communities. Can you tell us a little bit about why Justice40 is so important specifically to those frontline communities, what it would do in those spaces?
Well, thanks for that question. And Peggy really covered a lot of the 30,000 feet in terms of government policies and programs and the actions that would be moving forward under the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. But when you go to ground zero and look at why do we need something like this when we have laws, regulations, mandates, executive orders, when the rubber hits the ground, when infrastructure and funding is allocated, there's a term what I call infrastructure apartheid, which means that some communities get more than their fair share of good things and some get less. And if you look at the whole issue of where money investments go, oftentimes they leave out the most vulnerable population, the most marginalized communities. And so infrastructure and policy, there are three things that drive the inequality that we see in terms of outcomes: policy, planning, and finance, funding. And when you look at those things, you'll see that our water system, treatment system, our schools, our parks and green spaces, we talk about roads, dams, bridges. As a matter of fact, the United States has been given a C- when it comes to infrastructure. And if C-, I'm a college professor, C- is passing, barely, with grade inflation. But if you look at the infrastructure that are in communities of color and low-income communities in the United States, there are a number of those 17 categories that the American Society of Civil Engineers have given those D-. D- is not, you don't want to get a D-. You can't come home with a D-.
I could not.
No, me either. So those failing infrastructure, you'll find them, a disproportionate share of those are in low-income communities and communities of color and frontline communities. And so what we have to really make sure that money will follow need as opposed to money following money, money following power. And when you look at the outcome, the reality is when you put it on the map, and we have great tools to map this stuff now. We can map where the pollution is, where the methane is. We can map where the other kinds of environmental problems are. But we can also map where the money. Follow the money trail, and you can almost predict by a census tract, a zip code, or another geographic area, which areas where money should go to address the inequality that's been going on for, in some cases, decades, in terms of racial redlining, for centuries. So that's why Justice40 is so important, but also having the screening tools and having the information that policymakers can make, and having the organizations on the ground who have that same information to make sure that they push the money toward where they need, as opposed to having the money flow to people who can fill out the best proposals and applications.
I think that's one of the things that, as we're talking about methane and talking about mapping and tools, what makes the methane conversation so important for COP26. And really, let's tie it together, I think, with Justice40, because you just explained how mapping is so important. There's a huge hole when it comes to infrastructure and these needs being accounted for in vulnerable populations. Dr. Wright, I want to come to you and talk, a little bit about the fact that we know the energy, waste, agriculture are some of the key areas we can cut methane. How do we fill those holes? What are we missing? How do we make that connection between the mapping and getting it where it needs to be to the people who need it?
Well, thank you, Heather. I think that it's coming to me now to talk about really local level stuff, in that I am from the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor, a director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, whose first case was dealing with a landfill, the Agriculture Street landfill. And I have to tell you, For us, methane is not where we begin. Methane is where we end. It's a good byproduct of the work that we do. So if you tackle the toxins, then you end up tackling methane. So I want to make certain that is clear. In all the work that I've done on the ground with communities who are really suffering from pollution, with their screens rusting off and falling in 3 months, everything that they plant dies, turns black overnight, waking up hoarse like I am, but specifically from chemicals and not from just sinus, as I think that's what I have. All of the diseases, the high cancer rates, all of that is because of toxic pollution. When we began our work, we were working on toxic pollution. We knew there were bad smells, but we never put methane at the front of our struggle. Now that people have made the connection between air pollution, toxic greenhouse gases, and pollution and climate change, our issues have now floated to the top of this. But what I don't want to be forgotten is that while methane certainly is important in dealing with climate change, it is not the only thing that people of color, poor communities are concerned about. We're concerned about our bodies being poisoned. We're concerned about the body burden that we carry for everything, including exposure to methane. And I want to speak specifically about a community in Pensacola, Florida, that we work with, the Wedgwood community, that has 13 landfills with signs that say, be caution, beware, the air quality is bad because of methane. So we live with the bad impacts of methane, not just for greenhouse gases, but because it impacts the quality of our lives, and we are dying because of it. So we are on board with everything that will reduce pollution, including methane being an important part of that conversation.
I think that is such an important point to connect the dots, the intersectionality between lived experience and everyday life, the science, and the money. Because those things tied together is really what helps us drive solution. So now how do we make it happen? We talk about solutions. We know that Justice40 is an opportunity that's out here, and we have wonderful science data that's driving us more and more to be able to really pinpoint where these problems are coming from. How do we get people to really embrace and then be empowered to make the solutions happen? Dr. Wright, I'm going to come back to you on a local level, but I would also like to go to you as well, Ms. Shepard, to talk about even from an urban perspective, because I think you too, we're bringing a really diverse perspective, rural versus urban, very different demographics. Dr. Wright, you want to start with that?
Oh, well, I wanted to make the connection between recommendations that are being made with Justice40 that could also help us deal with pollution and methane. And so within our recommendations, there are whole sections on what we call community resilience. So if you're going to talk about community resilience, then within that, it means that we should be developing programs around waste, around energy, around transportation for communities in particular, and workforce development. That is, developing programs that will allow people in our community to benefit from the renewable economy that's moving forward. And so I jotted down a few things. If we deal specifically with energy and community resilience, then community solar becomes very important. Rooftop solar, all of these things that could help us not be on the grid, reduce our electric bills, deal with energy democracy. The Justice40 actually has recommendations in all of these areas for programs that could support these kinds of issues. Waste management. In urban communities, dumping is a horrible problem. We really had to work with our city council to help them to understand that when you're dealing with waste, and in urban communities you're dealing with dumping, if you don't have a good waste management plan, then you're adding to greenhouse gases through methane, not reducing it. So putting the kinds of programs in place with money to support communities actively being involved in solving these problems is what Justice40 can do. And I believe that the Justice40 the WeACT has put forth hundreds of recommendations to deal with community resilience. Our hope is that those recommendations will be honored, and we're really on edge waiting to see which of our recommendations will be accepted by the interagency working group, or whatever we call it now, but the group that has the power to move these forward. We have done our work. We're waiting for them to do their work. And I believe that that would help communities on the ground the most.
Ms. Shepard?
Yeah, well, I work in Harlem in an urban community. We're a membership-based organization, and we believe that by organizing the most affected people, that we can begin to impact environmental policy. So the first thing we need in terms of methane is disclosure. And so the EDF methane satellite and some of the other initiatives that are happening around the country will begin to give us the data so that we understand the leakage, and so we can then begin to correlate that with the health risk that are impacting communities of color. So again, why do we need data? We need data for evidence-based campaigns to make a difference with policymakers, with legislation, and telling our story to the media. And so again, we've got to have that data. The disclosure is a first step for us really understanding the impact and the scope of the problem. And then again, we need an organized citizenry who understand the issue, because we've got to do the education, because they have got to educate our elected officials. And we've got to begin to move policy in the direction that is more protective of our health, our safety, and our communities.
Health, safety, and community, I think, are the places where we all can agree we reside, and that's what's, hits home to us. Dr. Bullard, you wrote a book called Dumping in Dixie that has to do with health, has to do with the disparities that we've seen. Can you talk to us a little bit about something that you said a moment before, and I want us to come back to this. It has to do, though, with money and making sure that the funding and the infrastructure dollars that are necessary get to the most vulnerable populations, and how that can be a health indicator, one that improves health. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I wrote Dumping in Dixie 30 years ago, 1990, and they're probably some of the people in the audience were not born. But again, a lot of the issues that we dealt with in Dumping in Dixie in terms of which communities are more likely to be on the receiving end of all kinds of negative externalities. And in this case, we were looking at the southern United States and the impact of landfills and other kinds of facilities that were located in communities of color. So the southern United States is the global south internally in the United States in terms of those issues. So we have to come up with real solutions, not false solutions. And I think a lot of the information that gets pushed out can somehow give the impression that jobs, and that the oil and gas industry somehow has created an economic renaissance in those communities that I was looking at in Dumping in Dixie. But if you look at the communities that live closest to the fence line, if the jobs were for them, they could walk to work across the fence, but the jobs were not. They were jobs for people who drive in, spend 8 hours, and drive out. The communities on the fence line were left with pollution, poverty, and they were left with illnesses. What we have to make sure is that as we transition to a clean energy economy, that we don't reproduce that inequality by not addressing the issue of equity. And the fact that democratizing that movement of from dirty to clean, and not leave behind the dirty in the communities of color. If we look at the transition from closing dirty coal power plants, they're still, for example, the dirtiest of the dirtiest, the dirty dozen, are located in communities of color. And that's 75% of the dirtiest are in people of color. So when we talk about oil refineries, the dirtiest of the oil refineries are disproportionately located in communities of color. So as we transition away from that, I think communities of color have always had to wait at the tail end of the line as that transition. And so the money oftentimes will be sent toward the more affluent and those communities that are considered valued communities, whereas sacrifice zones or communities that are inundated with all kinds of landfills and other kinds of polluting facilities, greenhouse gases, but also those co-pollutants that create health problems. So what we have to do is to make sure that a just transition is just, fair, and equitable, and not somehow that we leave behind the just and just say we're going to transition from dirty to clean and somehow not bring that framework is that the dirty always takes longer to get out of our communities than others. And what's left is that the environmental health disparities that result from having to live with pollution longer and more intense. It's not just the methane, it's those other pollution that's coming from those industries that are saturated in our communities. And the thinking is that if you got 5 different polluting facilities, it's easier to get 6. If you got 10, it's easier to get 11 because the thinking is one more won't make a difference. What we say is, yes, one more will make a difference. And so what we're saying, a just transition and an equitable energy justice framework will say no. The communities that have borne the burden the longest and the more intense should be at the front of the line because they don't have the luxury of good health, of a level of resilience that can allow them to fend off these other kinds of environmental assaults. That's a justice. So this energy justice includes economic justice, climate justice, economic justice, reproductive justice, health justice, all rolled into one movement. That's, when we talk about the methane moment, that's the moment that we're talking about right now, where these issues and the research, and I'm a researcher and I like to write, I like to document. The research is showing that we don't have a lot of time to debate or wait 10 years to say, well, we're going to free up these communities that are overburdened. This is where the money needs to track, and that's what we're fighting for in our WeACT and those recommendations that Peggy and Beverly said. That's what we are here about and working with communities in our support role.
You know, each of you have worked tirelessly in this space, and I personally want to say thank you for the work that you've not only done, but you're continuing to do, but also the lessons that you're teaching. And I know that we're here at COP26. This is a global forum and opportunity to talk to the world about what solutions really we should be focusing on. What lessons do you have for our international audience based upon what you've learned in the United States, based upon environmental justice? What lessons can the rest of the world take away from your experience, but also the understanding of the urgency of this moment? I'm going to go with you, Dr. Buller, to start, and then we'll go on down the line.
What we say is that that environmental justice, climate justice, energy justice, food and water justice, these issues are global. And the fact that what we do in the United States impacts what happens abroad. And so when we say what's happening with the global South and the need for justice and need for this whole idea of making sure that no nation is left behind just because of lack of resources or lack of infrastructure. So we're talking about investments in the South, Southern United States, and the U.S. South. And when we talk about this whole question of when, we're talking about the urgency of now, the urgency of now.
Dr. Wright?
So I would say over the last 30 years, we've learned a lot of lessons. I can't share all of them with you right at this point. But I will say this, and that is that we have a motto in our office on how we do our work. We do not recommend any new policy or regulation or support any technology that doesn't do 3 things. That does 3 things. It does no harm to people. It does not perpetuate disproportionate pollution burdens, and it does not contribute to climate change. These are the 3 I guess you'd call it our motto in moving forward when we're asked to join. In terms of the work that we do, I can say the lesson that I learned is this, that an educated populace is what is needed for us to make change. And so we invest all of our time in, first of all, educating communities on the ground so that they have self-determination and speak for themselves. I've never found a community that was well-informed that did not make the right decision. Yeah. They only made bad decisions when they did not have information. And so we see ourselves as moving forward with a model that we've called Communiversity, as putting together the resources of universities with the knowledge of community people on the ground. What comes out of that is success and change.
Ms. Shepard?
Yeah. Well, I would say, certainly as I've been listening to so many sessions here at COP26, we need no more false solutions. We need no more false solutions of huge investments in carbon sequestration, carbon capture, enhanced nuclear, hydrogen that's coming again from fossil fuels, because we know that those new facilities will continue to go into communities of color. We hear a lot about market-based solutions. Market-based solutions have gotten our communities where they are today. However, we could talk about some solutions that include a mandatory reduction in communities of color that are overburdened. So we can begin to think and plan and consider what those models would look like. And then again, we've got to have community consultation. And business and industry need to become anchor institutions in the communities in which they work and where they have sites and where they have operations. And if they begin to become anchor institutions and also make those investments, in addition to the Justice40 that the government is doing, we can begin to have those solutions that will work, and solutions that come directly from the lives and experiences of the people who are most impacted.
Mm-hmm. I am just really encouraged to hear each of you, and we're going to have some time for audience questions. So I want the audience to begin to prepare their questions as I ask the last question before we get to audience questions. And don't worry, audience, if you don't have any questions, I have plenty for this panel. I always have questions for them. But I do want you to begin thinking about that as we move into sort of the second half of our conversation. We have talked about communities and solutions and where we see some of these holes. I want to talk about jobs and economy for a moment, because often that piece is left out of what needs to be a part of not only environmental justice, but what the next generation has to look forward to. I have a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old home. I need them to have a job. What are the sectors that you feel strongly we should look to ensure that vulnerable populations are included in? Are there any in specific that jump to mind? Peggy, we'll start, Ms. Shepard, we'll start with you and come back through. But I would love to talk about jobs and economy right now.
Yeah. You know, when we talk about Justice40 and we look at the hundreds of pages of recommendations made by the WeACT to the Biden administration, we know that the construction trades are going to be very important. Yet we also know that most people of color are not in the construction trades, that there's often a bias that keeps them out. And then depending on the region in which you live, for instance, the South, they don't have unions. So what kind of worker associations can we begin to create that gives workers an ownership in that association and that really give them the empowerment and the autonomy that means so much to our lives? We know that money needs to go to energy conservation, energy efficiencies, solar and other kinds of renewables. But we also know that there's a lot of job training going on. You know, my organization has trained hundreds of workers, yet the unions say, send us, we've got 10 openings. And so how do we create a pipeline for the jobs that are there? Not just willy-nilly training, but for the jobs that are there. How do we make those alliances and those linkages with the companies that have the jobs so that we can send them the people who are trained? So that's going to be very, very important. I think when we talk about Justice40 and how that investment is made, we need to ensure that there are community partners in all of these RFPs that are going to be going out for very large amounts of money for construction, for retrofits, for all of those kinds of issues. We've got to have the strong training and pipeline to jobs.
Let's build off of that strong training. Dr. Wright, I know you have talked about training opportunities in South Louisiana and even with solar and electricity. Can you share with us a bit about what that looks like for you?
Well, both Dr. Bullitt and I have been involved in a hazardous waste training program for 25 years with monies from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. What's important for you to know about that program is that the Minority Worker Training Program, whose name was changed to the Environmental Career Workers Training Program because Republicans didn't like the idea of pointing to minorities for jobs, that particular program has had a total of $3 million for 25 years. It has never gone up. And it is still there, yet it has the best track record for training and placement of any of the other training programs. The only difference is it focuses on minorities. So you're talking about a system that is basically racist. And so when we talk about jobs, we have to be sure that whatever we put in place addresses the points. Trash in, trash out. If you have a model where you're putting a good program in a dirty bottle, you're going to get something like what we have. 25 years, $3 million, while other programs get billions. And so we are looking forward to becoming involved in creating that pipeline for the new workers that we need in solar and hydro, and also encouraging minorities to, or people of color, I should say, to start their own businesses. Making certain that the Small Business Administration understands that it should be supporting small nonprofits and with this new economy that's moving forward. Once again, we'll be the place where carbon sequestration is. We'll be the place where everything that's new, that's being built, that has a nasty byproduct, will be in our communities, and there will be no benefits for us. Certainly we'd like to move forward in a way where everybody is safe. But we have to fight to be a part of that economy. We have to fight to be a part of the training. We have to fight to be a part of the owners of these new businesses that will be moving forward. It is a big job. And there are still things that we don't recognize that will stop our progress, that we need to investigate more, really look closely at rules and regulations that are put in place for new startup programs, for education, training, for new businesses, etc.
And Heather, there's $30 billion in the reconciliation bill for the Civilian Climate Corps.
Let's say that again, 30 billion with a B? Okay. Mm-hmm.
30 billion for the Civilian Climate Corps. And we believe that that money needs to go to create that pipeline, not only to construction and worker training kinds of positions, but to create new policy folks, new leaders within our movement, folks who live in a community and can help develop the solutions for that community, and again emerge as the new leaders in the youth movement that we need, who are going to carry on these issues because they're going to be most affected over the course of their lives. So real strong support for that Civilian Climate Corps and other kinds of programs that create that kind of initiative in our frontline communities.
Dr. Bullitt?
As an educator, and with the majority of my academic career spent at historically black colleges and universities, I think that's produced a larger portion of the population in terms of sending young people out doing all kinds of creative things, careers. I think it's important that our HBCUs and other minority serving institutions, Hispanic serving, Indian serving, and Asian serving institutions also capture a significant portion of the funds to push forward these new careers and not allow the technical training, the professional careers to somehow remain less diverse with our talent. And so, yes, we need to make sure that we have our job training program for workers, but also having our universities also move forward in a very aggressive way in capturing those dollars and making sure that we're not somehow invisible or forgotten. And those of us who have a megaphone, we are pushing forward. We made sure that that those recommendations were written into the WeACT's final report, and we are still monitoring and calling and making sure that that it doesn't end up on the cutting floor. Mm-hmm. Now, those are real things that we see coming down the line, and the Build Back Better and the infrastructure, all those things will happen. We know they'll happen, and we have to make sure that they happen in a way that somehow don't end up with individuals having amnesia as to why we were proposing those things and who made it possible for those kinds of legislation and proposals and actions to be made.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's turn now to the audience for any questions in our remaining moments. If you have a question, if you'll please raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone. Yes. And if you'll please tell us your name and where you're from.
Yes, hello, my name is Isaias Hernandez. I am originally from Los Angeles, California. I am a young environmental justice advocate and educator and had read about all your years' worth of contribution to the environmental justice movement and how we often as young people continuously need to cite and thank the ones who have paved the way for this movement. One of the hardest things I've seen is how a majority of public educational systems fail to talk about environmental justice education. Specifically, when you look at K through 12 education, how can we push to have more collaborations with environmental justice organizations and public schools, since there is already a lack of funding that goes into both systems that currently exist?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to repeat that. That is, how do we push for more collaboration between environmental justice organizations and public schools, K through 12, especially in light of the lack of funding? Which one of you want to jump on that one first? I see both Peggy and Dr. Wright. Ms. Shepard.
Yeah, so in New York, we've started a statewide coalition that's working to develop legislation and also working with our state education task force to get them to include environmental justice and climate justice education in the public schools. We also have developed over the last 30 years an environmental justice and leadership training program, which we do run in several public schools, working with the science teachers, where we're training 90 students every spring semester for over a week in these issues, and then getting them to develop hands-on projects that they present, and we give them a variety of awards. But we're really going to need to do this at a local, state, and federal level if we really want to develop curriculum in our public schools that's institutionalized.
Dr. Wright?
Yes, you really hit on a sore spot for us. Because I would say almost 20 years ago, Dr. Bullitt and I applied for a grant with AAAS, which would be really the driver for, at secondary education, to have a curriculum developed that included environmental justice. At that time, we weren't talking so much about climate justice, but for us, it's the same thing. We did not get that grant. Some really large, predominantly white institution did, and I've seen no change. So let me just be clear. They got it, they did nothing. We, on the other hand, began pushing on our own. So believe it or not, in 1994, in the city of New Orleans, we implemented an environmental justice curriculum that was built with science teachers and social science teachers in the school system. And we had it implemented. Here comes charter schools, here comes mandatory testing, here comes nothing is being taught but what we need to teach to pass the test, right? And so that went away. So we began to do it during the summers only. Charter schools took over, all of that's gone. It has to be, and we all wish that we were like New York State. I can tell you, there's no state in the South that looks like New York State. You know, with these different environmental justice boards and stuff. Are you kidding me? That's not going to happen where we are. So we have to be innovative. And the AAAS, all of the large EPA environmental education grants, I would suggest that young people begin applying for those grants so that they have the funding to develop curriculums in their locale. And we will push to have it throughout the system, but it's going to be hard, but it is something that we should do. I have some more to say, but we don't have time.
Dr. Bullard?
Yeah, that's a very important issue because education is one of those areas where if you make that entree, you can get information to people early on. And K through 12, you're exactly right. There's no standardized curricula or a process of getting it into the school. It's almost like if you have a good school board and a good school superintendent that understands, you can move forward. Like here in Houston, we have a school that's in Houston Independent School District that is an environmental justice school, like a science and math or engineering. We have an environmental justice school, and it is on the east side, and it's where mostly Latinos are in that school area with one of the organizations, Tejas, which is a Latino organization that pushed for that, and it's a very good partnership relationship. But again, to get that reproduced and scaled up, oftentimes there's so many variables, just like Dr. Wright was saying, in terms of getting environmental education into, in terms of curricula, in terms of EPA's environmental education grant, getting the funding, getting the information codified, going through the regular process and saying these are curricula that have passed through the rigor. We're not there yet, even though we've been working on this for 20 years. It's time, and I will make also a recommendation, it's time for young people now who want to get this into the schools because it's very important. And I think it's time for this to happen.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation. And Dr. Bullard, I'm an assistant professor at the Boston College School of Social Work, and I use a couple of your books and your papers in my class. In fact, last week I taught the students, the MSW students, your environmental justice framework, the 5 principles, and I came here after the class. So, my question, essentially, partly you answered already, but there's this one aspect. Some of my research have been funded by the NIHS and NIH, but I see that the amount of research funding for the faculties to really invest and to do research in environmental justice is vastly outstripped by the other areas of research. And that really pains me, because that is my area of work, environmental racism. So how to really actively or passively coerce the NIHs or the NSFs or the Gates Foundation, these big funding agencies, to really invest in and fund for more research in the environmental racism piece?
I'm going to repeat that question. Thank you for that question. How do we encourage the NIHS, but also big philanthropy and groups to invest in R&D, research and data, particularly for environmental justice and environmental racism? Okay, I'm going to go Dr. Wright, and then I'm going to come to Dr. Bullard. I could tell you all have plenty to say on this issue.
Yeah. Well, what I can tell you is that one of the ways to bring about change is to bring about some change in people who head up these agencies. And I like to call out Dr. Ken Oden at NIHS. Whatever amount of research we have, or grants that we have that really deal with environmental justice happen because Dr. Ken Oden made a visit to Cancer Alley. It's one thing to work in your office and read about it, and he was not convinced. But we got him to come to Cancer Alley and take that tour and smell everything and get the headaches that we got and talk to the people who were suffering. And when he went back, he made amazing changes within that organization for research. So the first thing we have to do is try to identify who these leaders are and force them on a toxic tour. That will get them to maybe change their thinking a little bit. And once they change their thinking, everything flows, uphill or downhill from that. So I can just give you, that's been our personal experience. If you get a really idiot at the top that doesn't understand, environmental justice, environmental racism, nothing will change. So we have to push to get the right leaders because we know that that can make a difference.
Dr. Bullard?
Yeah, I think it's important that you continue to do the work because there will never be enough funds. But what we have to do is also collaborate and put funds together and have co-PIs. And we have to have those partnerships with the right people. Sometimes we have to tell folks who want to partner with us and use us, we have to say no. We don't agree on the framework. I think we also have to, and we're beginning to do that, get our funders to understand that racism, structural racism, is often the underlying condition that creates so much inequality in our society that if we are to address a lot of this structural inequality, that to not deal with racism is to miss the boat. And so we're now seeing more research and more funding going to racial justice. 30 years ago, they were running from anything that had race in it. And so we had to, some of my best research was done that was not funded because I couldn't get it funded. But the fact is it needed to be done whether you got a dime or not. And to some extent, that is what is today. And smart people sometimes will catch up. Smart people don't know everything. And so I think we have to kind of like move them along, including funders, to understand how these structural factors are the major factors that we need to be attacking, and you'll get results in terms that multiplier effect, in terms of better health, better economic outcomes, better quality of life. You'll get systemic change across the board in terms of intergenerational mobilization, in terms of young people and older people working together on these issues, schools, parks. You start naming, and it's limitless. But we have to be good communicators. Scientists are good at their science, but they're not that good at communicating. So we have to bring along our good communicators who their job is to do what? Communicate. And that's how we get more clarity in terms of presenting it to funders, whether it's government or private foundation.
We have time for one final question, and we will let this be our closer question before we wrap up.
Good morning, wonderful panel. I'm Donnell Wilkins. I am the founder and CEO of the Green Door Initiative out of Detroit, Michigan, where we've placed the world on wheels. And with that, we are a humongous legacy of environmental injustice and pollution. You guys have made a great case for why Justice40 should go to and be invested in communities like Detroit. We have borne the greatest burden of the past, and now this idea of, and we've also paid a great price, not only in our blood, sweat, and tears, and the racism and the setbacks, but also in taxes and other things that people done. We're seeking a return on our investments. It's the best way I can place it. With that, how do you envision Justice40 actually getting into the hands of fence line leadership in communities that have a proven track record, whether it's job, workforce development, fighting for policies that improve our communities and whatever, not just investing in our communities, but investing in the people who are actually proven, because we're often competing with mainstream organizations, big entities who actually there's an oversight. What are your recommendations for ensuring that organizations such as the Green Door Initiative be the recipients of these resources to continue the great work that we're doing?
That is an excellent closer question. I'm just going to repeat that. How do we make sure that the Justice40 funding gets to the people who need it, gets to the frontline organizations and the communities and the actual people that need it in order to be successful? Dr. Bullard, Dr. Wright, and Ms. Shepard, I'm going to ask you all to try to answer that question briefly, but we're going to start with you, Dr. Bullard, and we're going to end with you, Ms. Shepard.
I think the key to that is to make sure that we have strong community partners, and I'm speaking for myself in terms of as a director of the Robert Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University in Houston. The communities that we work with, we have long-standing relationships with. They trust us, and we trust them. And so having strong relationships and having strong research capability to track monies, to track policies, and make sure that it's not getting diverted to the west side, if you understand what I'm saying, and stay on the east side. That's how we have to do it. We have to follow through and be fearless in that pursuit.
Dr. Wright?
Ditto to that. But I have to tell you that as a WeACT member, and I think I speak for all of us, we feel a really great burden and a lot of responsibility for what's going to come out of this process. You can believe that we're up at night wondering, trying to make certain that this happens, because our names are on this. We want to make certain that we're not being used. In other words, our names are on it, but it's going to be the same old, same old. The only thing that I can tell you is that I think the administration understands that they've messed with some old fighters. And so we've been doing this for a long time. We don't have a reputation for being quiet. So if it doesn't come down right, you will hear from me. And I will be moving from this side, across the line with the demonstrators if we don't get this right. All I can give you is my word that we'll do the best that we can. That's all we can do.
Ms. Shepard.
Yeah, and I'll say ditto. As co-chair of the WeACT, we've got 26 kick-ass members from all across this country that are going to be holding the administration accountable. But also, philanthropy has taken a look at this, and philanthropy is putting money and eyes on this process. But we've got to have a strong national communications plan, because most of our elected officials have never heard of Justice40. Most of our community leaders have never heard of it. So we've got to have a strong communications plan. We've got to begin to brief all of our local and state elected officials, and we've also got to organize community groups on the ground to hold their elected officials accountable. Community organizing is going to be very, very critical in holding locals accountable as well as the federal government.
I think do we have time for one more? Oh, we have time for one more. Oh, I'm getting mixed signals here. I am told that we need to move
question is
forward. We're going to do one very quick final question.
I was promised. So
yes, ma'am.
Quickly, I know that Dr. Wright and Dr. Bullard, you have traveled to COP after COP after COP after COP.
Okay, that's long enough.
What do you make out of your participation in this particular COP at the end of 1 week? And to you too, Peggy Shepard.
What do you make out of your participation at COP after this 1 week based upon your experiences of previous COPs? Dr. Wright, I'll start with you.
Oh, well, what I can say is this is the first COP that I've seen so many people of color. I've never seen as many people, a diverse group where it's not predominantly.
I think there's a little, give us one moment. So we appreciate that quick interruption for health and safety reasons. I hope all of our virtual audience knows that we are doing our best to stay COVID-free and safe here at COP. So now let's move.
I'm just gonna move on, but make it short.
Okay.
The diversity that I see here is more than what I've ever seen in the COP after COP after COP after COP meetings that I have attended. I also can say that at this COP, if you remember last COP, we weren't even in it, so it was really kind of pathetic. But this time we have hope. And I like to tell people, we can't, there's no guarantees, but we have hope. And we plan to stay involved in the process, for climate change. So it's just hopeful this time. That's what I would say.
Ms. Shepard?
So I was at a panel the other day, and I was asked about the presence of justice here, and I said that there was very little. That in individual sessions, there might have been a couple of comments about equity and justice, but there was no presence. So those of us here have decided that at the next COP, we are going to have an environmental justice and equity pavilion.
Thank you.
So we invite you all to come next year, and we will have a series of sessions around justice and equity, and we invite you all to be there.
Yeah.
Dr. Bullard, we give our final quick word.
I think quickly, I think it's important that we understand that all COPs are different, and that we have to make sure that we get justice in the room, and sometimes it's more difficult than others. Coming here is very expensive, and so in terms of having our leaders, grassroots leaders, and organizations present, and the work that goes on outside of the official room is just as important. In some cases, may be more important in building those relationships, continuing those relationships. All of that has continued, and I think we have to keep it going. Thank you.
Dr. Bullard, Dr. Wright, Ms. Shepard, thank you all for being here with us on this panel. Thank you for being accountability partners to us at the Environmental Defense Fund. This has been a wonderful time. I have learned so much, and I hope that you and our audience, both here present and virtually, have some takeaway items, some homework to do in order to maintain this activism and this action, and that you will follow both EDF as well as all of our panel organizations, WeACT for Justice, Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, Dr. Bullard at Texas Southern, and let's keep collaborating on this together. Thank you so much for being here.